All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Campaign Optimization Series. This session is titled The New Marketing Imperative, Audience First and Experience Driven. I'm Claudia Tarico, editor of Demand Gen Report, and I will be your moderator for this presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a really great session lined up for you. I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping slides before we kick things off. All right, so for those who are new to Demand Gen Report, welcome. We are an online media company. We publish everything from daily news, a weekly email newsletter, special reports, research, and a rich menu of additional resources. So if you haven't done so already, join more than 75,000 subscribers by subscribing to dgr.com today. And of course, don't forget to check us out on LinkedIn and Twitter. All of the handles are right here on your screen, and we look forward to engaging with you on social. I also want to take this time to introduce a new event we have lined up. It's coming up this June. It's the B2B Marketing Exchange Next Level ABM online experience. And you know, ABM has evolved to become this huge business imperative in B2B. So we created this event to really provide the audience with a playbook for standing out with target accounts across channels. So it's the B2B Marketing Exchange as we all know and love. With a little bit of an ABM twist. So check it out. Registration is now open. We hope to see you there in June. We're also really excited to be partnering with our friends at Grubhub yet again for the series. So we'll be giving away some free lunch to some lucky attendees while they enjoy the sessions this week. So check your inboxes. You might get a yummy email from Grubhub to access that free lunch credit. All right, last but not least, just going to walk through the On24 platform that we'll be using today. So you can access everything that you need, all of the information and resources and all that fun stuff on this toolbar on your screen. During and after today's session, follow along and share your thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag #COSeries. We also encourage you to ask our presenter questions. So you have this Q&A widget at the top right corner of your screen. So use that to submit any questions throughout the session. We're slated to run about 25 to 30 minutes with a few additional minutes for Q&A after. So submit those questions and we'll hopefully get to them at the end of the session. And then if you want to see what else we have in store for the series this year, access all of the COS sessions on the bottom left of your screen, and then on the bottom right of your screen, you'll find some additional resources that we've made available to you. The session, of course, as always, is being recorded, and all of our attendees will receive an archive link to go back and review, share with colleagues, all that fun stuff. And then in addition to joining the conversation online, using that hashtag on Twitter, please take our very brief survey that will automatically launch when the session ends. We just want to continue to make our virtual events and our webinar series as good as possible to your liking. So please take that survey whenever you can. You could actually also complete and submit the survey at any time during the webinar using that survey icon that's circled at the bottom of your screen. So before signing off today, please take a moment to take that quick questionnaire. All right, now I'm so pleased to introduce our featured speaker for today, Cherie Keith. Cherie is the head of strategy and research at On24. And prior to joining the On24 team, she was a principal analyst at Forrester and Sirius Decisions. And she covered everything from in-person to digital event strategies and technology. So we're in good hands. I think I covered it all. So I'm going to pass things over to Cherie now to take it away. All yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claudia. So what we're here today to talk about is this idea of what's next for marketers. We know that a lot has changed, but we're now in the driver's seat and we're in control of our destiny. So now it's time to really think about what our new imperatives are moving forward. And with that, I want to start by just grounding ourselves in some of the data and how the B2B journey was changing for buyers, even pre-pandemic. So one thing that we knew for sure is that B2B marketing and sales was not getting easier. We know that, and we see this actually through the lens of some different data. I'm sharing some serious decisions data here that looks at kind of over time what the trends have been. So we saw that even pre-pandemic, more people were involved in B2B buying. We also saw that the average length of purchasing was taking longer. And finally, we saw that B2B buyers were consuming more interactions throughout their journey. So we take all of that. We understand it's more involved, there's a longer time frame, but then we pair that with the fact that buyers are also looking to be in more control of their journey. And we rely on Forrester here for their research when it looks at the percentage of B2B buyers that are looking to self-educate and how much of their journey they're looking to do at their own pace and in their own timing. So this is important because this really speaks overall to the need for us to be creating experiences for our audiences to be consuming. We know that they're going to be going and getting their own content, so we need to make sure that it's contextualized and it's taking into account their perspectives of how they want to be consuming this information. Now, again, all of this was happening pre-pandemic. But really what we throw into the mix here then is this added complexity of what happened in 2020. And quite honestly, we don't have a lot of great data to fully understand the impact that it had on the buyer's journey in the past, year that we're looking at here. But we know that things got disrupted. And so while we're still waiting for the final results in a lot of ways, we know that at a minimum, two things happened to our buyers. There were those that accelerated their journey. Perhaps they had more access to capital. They were able to buy things in a faster way. Perhaps your product that you were marketing to them became something that became essential. And on the flip side, we saw B2B buyers that struggled. We saw ones where perhaps that purchasing decision got removed from the table, or maybe even there's a scenario where it took longer. More people had to be involved, or even the purchase price that they were looking at had to come down. And while we think about just that impact, this idea that we saw bifurcation across buyers in all of these kind of core areas, and we're probably not going to see another tectonic shift like this before, but a world that was already really complex became increasingly complex as we juggled all of these factors. And the thing to keep in mind, though, is as people had all of this change from a marketing perspective, the buyers were still consuming information. Just because things got delayed didn't mean that they weren't going to be looking out for interactions for them to be consuming. So while this was a change from the buyer's perspective, certainly we saw it in a really siloed view as marketers. We saw touch points disappear, but buyers were still out there trying to access content. And I think what's most important, especially when I look at the data about the way that people consume digital experiences over the past year, is that it exploded. But more importantly, as we created more engaging experiences for audiences, the reaction from the audiences was actually exponential to what marketers had put out into market. So there's a lot to remember from the pandemic, and be it those exciting Netflix series that we all consumed, or perhaps some of those newly learned hobbies that a lot of us took on, like bread making and knitting and things like that. But when we think about the trend in marketing, we think about it through two lenses. And the first is this idea that we still need human engagement, regardless of the delivery mechanism. And we needed human engagement certainly in sales and marketing pre-pandemic. That's, of course, why B2B sales is such a strong function. But what we really had to do over the past year is learn how to do it all digitally. So that was a new muscle for people. And that really accelerated digital marketing in a lot of ways. And I think the important thing here is that while it really accelerated how we interacted digitally in a way that drove engagement, we also saw so much participation from audiences. Now, the second part of this is really what marketers need to be thinking about more, which is the importance of buying sensors and signals. A lot of people who had an over-rotated marketing mix towards physical learned about all the data that you can get, first-party behavioral data from your audiences through these digital delivery mechanisms. And people really understood the power of this, but they were still in the capturing phase of this. And, you know, so many eyes were opened, I think, really as a result of this. And I think that by being better listeners in the future, marketers are going to really unlock the value of being able to do more with this. So here we are today. We have had this ever-changing, evolving buyer's journey, and we saw that pre-pandemic. We see more people involved, a longer purchase price. And then we have the tectonic shifts of last year, which really adds to the complexity from this idea of having similar cohorts that had different buying experiences as a result of the impact of the pandemic. But now we need to put all this together. And when we do, what I'm seeing is really the future of marketing, and what our new imperative is to make sure that we're not on our heels anymore, and make sure that the experiences that we're creating have to be audience-centric, but they also have to be experience-driven. So we're putting this all together. And this is certainly something I feel really passionately about. But I think when we start to remove the shackles of thinking about things in silos and only particular channels that we're looking to use and filling up content in all of those different buckets, and we start thinking about it in an experiential way, we're going to be able to market to our audiences in a better way. So the way that I'm thinking about this from the perspective of the audiences is to really break down each experience that you're building. And they have 5 layers. And this, I think, is really helpful both from a framework perspective, but also to make sure that, I think this changes the conversations within a marketing team, where we're not just focused on how many tweets we need to get out. It's, all right, what's the overall context that we're building as part of that experience? So the first layer of it, of course, is to think about the content that you want to bring to market. What's the messaging? What's the idea that we're looking to put out there? The first level of our experience. The second level is the delivery mechanism. So how are we going to reach those audiences? And certainly for a single experience, there could be multiple delivery mechanisms that we're using. Especially if you think about the event construct, we'll have different delivery mechanisms pre, at, and post-event. So, of course, making sure that the content is the first level and then the delivery mechanism is the second. And then this is where we start to get into, in my opinion, is the funnest part, which is thinking about what do we do once we have someone at an experience with us? How do we think about engaging them? We have an audience, and this, of course, is extremely relevant. Even if you're not talking about an event, the experience can be someone landing on your website. It could be them consuming a white paper of yours. What are you doing to keep them engaged while they're there? The next layer of that gets to what actions we look for the audience to take at the end of the experience. So a lot of people have been talking about like no dead ends in marketing. Buyer enablement is a big trend. How do we make sure that people can continue to consume and continue to self-educate? So having a really strong call to action strategy that is inherently and tightly aligned to the delivery mechanism that you're using, the content, as well as that engagement technique. You need to make sure this is all stitched together and makes sense from an audience's perspective. Now, the final layer is really where we think about how marketing takes action on the results of the engagement techniques that you've been using, as well as the calls to action. So putting this all together here. How can we be really great listeners, like I was talking about before? How can we make sure that the follow-up after the end of it, whether that be from a salesperson or a marketing touch, is contextualized, shows that we understood what you just consumed? This is critically important for us. So keeping in mind that we have these idea of 5 layers, we also then need to really be audience-centric. Think about it from the perspective of those experiences that are going to lay across the entire buyer and customer journey. So if we put these two concepts together, this notion that, of course, it's not perfectly linear, but there are certain cognitive decision gates that buyers and customers go through in their journey with us. And then knowing that we're trying to create experiences that are multi-layered and have different calls to action based on different parts of the buyer's journey. So I've put this all together, and actually on the next slide I have what is meant to be an example. Please don't take that this necessarily as the gospel, but something for you to be able to take and fill in at your own leisure. And really what I want to advocate for is that you're thinking about this in a vertical nature. So for example, if you are doing a webinar and it's very much thought leadership in nature, the appropriate call to action that you would do, the way you would look to engage attendees during that experience, wouldn't be the same as if you are doing a session that's focused on product adoption. So back to that thought leadership idea, perhaps you pay to have an amazing third-party speaker come in. They share exciting data and really get the audience excited about the concepts and kind of the bigger picture. The appropriate call to action there might not be to speak with sales. That might not be appropriate in the buyer's journey. Perhaps the best call to action in that scenario would be something like subscribing to an ongoing series of content, joining the next in the expert series, or something like that. And the way we treat them coming out of that experience should also be tailored. Whereas on the flip side, if you're doing a product roadmap digital experience and you're pulling in known customers, the way you're going to treat them, engage them when they're there, and then give them calls to action afterwards should be drastically different. This is where you would be looking at different engagement and calls to action techniques about perhaps leaving a product review. We know third-party review sites are very important in B2B. This is a great place to use that as a call to action for someone who just heard about your product roadmap. This could also be where you're looking to provide additional experiences for someone to consume. Certification is a great way to engage your customers. That could either be about product certification or certification that is more thought leadership in nature, that shares best practices and approaches that will arm your customers with really important information to make them better at their job. So to close out on this part here, the whole idea is to make sure that you're thinking about the experiences through the audience's view, and make sure that as you are creating these experiences, you're thinking about the pre, at, and post context, but also how we're going to involve the audience when we have their attention and what we can give to them afterwards. And at the same time, make sure that we're always listening, because there is a maturity curve when it comes to listening to audiences and being able to react to the information that they're providing back to us. So with that, I want to talk a little bit more about buying signals. And I think what's most important here is if we think about, and this is certainly a very exaggerated view, but there's this idea of maturity. There are people that would say after an experience, I'm going to put people into a sequential nurture, and they're going to receive an education email, a solution email, and a selection email. And we're just going to keep rotating through that. But then we have people who got a little bit more, I would say this is really the influence of marketing automation here. We got really data-driven and lost sight of actually listening, and we were prescribing. Well, we know that after an experience, you are going to need 4 education touches and then 5 solution touches, and then we're going to close out with 4 selection touches. And it becomes sequential, but in a very prescribed manner. But really the vision for where we want to be going is thinking about things in a way where we're taking advantage of the signals people are giving us. We're actually creating tailored follow-up based on what we should know about what they did with us. And I actually have 2 examples that we'll walk through here. So thinking about it from the perspective of using polling, which has been something I've been talking about a lot lately, but this is important because polls can be used in a very basic way, I would say. And that's the example we have up on screen first. So we've created a digital experience where it is more selection stage in nature. So we're really focused on helping someone to understand why they should be choosing us, not just our approach, but why they should choose to work with us as a partner. And the calls to action, the engagement techniques are very focused on getting someone to sales because, again, this is lower bottom of the funnel approach. So perhaps the polling question we would use was, do you want to speak to sales? Now, I don't always encourage this as a good call to action in a thought leadership webinar, because just because they don't want to talk to sales at that moment doesn't mean they won't want to speak with them in a week, 2 weeks, 3 months, or anything like that. But again, a very tailored experience around pretty much a known entity. And so certainly if someone says yes, we want to make sure that we're working with sales and getting that information to them. But if someone says no, again, that shouldn't be the end of the cycle here. It's what other information can we give them from a marketing perspective to make sure that we're evaluating them for ongoing placement and nurtures, or what other types of experiences we can queue up. Now, the next example is one where we think about how polling and those engagement techniques, like I was talking about earlier, are much more aligned with the overall experience and the content. So in this little faux example here, we're thinking about an HR technology company that has some software services that look to help you improve your employee retention. So they have put on a thought leadership style digital experience with an external speaker, and this person is sharing industry benchmark data. So what they're sharing is what good employee retention rates look like. So first of all, people love this type of information, and I'll share some benchmarking with you shortly. But so we put that in front of someone. And then as a result, we have a poll that comes directly after it. So alignment between messaging and engagement. And we ask people to respond to how they're doing in comparison to benchmark. And this is really powerful, because based on what their responses are, we get a lot of information about them, and we can treat these audience members very differently as a result. So we think about first how we would treat someone who says they're at industry average. So, a little tap on the back to them. But really that follow-up from sales could focus on how to take their employee retention best practices to the next level. Very different than just pushing a product right away, or even saying we want to get you to best practice. Now, if we have someone self-reporting that they're already doing better than best practice, perhaps the way that we would follow up with them after this experience is to offer up to them the chance to submit for an award if you're doing like company style awards, or invite them to speak at one of your upcoming events. Now, finally, if we have someone who reports that they're doing worse than industry average, this is where that consultative follow-up could be really impactful. This is where you could say, we want to help you get to best practice. What are the challenges you're having in reaching industry standard? So 3 very different follow-ups that really change the conversation and the context that we're dealing with these companies in with that respect. Now, I did want to close out today's session, since I was just talking about benchmarking, with some of the insight that I've been pulling out of really the year that was. I started by talking about kind of how the buyer's journey has changed, but really how audiences have consumed digital experiences has changed over the past year. But also how marketers have deployed them has also changed, which is really exciting for someone who likes to geek out way too much on this stuff to see. So I'm just going to kind of pull out 4 pieces of data that I think are really important. And this is a lot of the benchmarking data that I rely on in the research and strategy that I do at On24. So what's really interesting is over the past year, we saw people asking more questions on digital experiences. So I look at this through the lens, in particular here, of the average number of questions per webinar. We saw that go up. But more importantly, we also saw people thinking beyond just a webinar and thinking about the other types of experiences we can create in the digital realm. And one of those was by creating personalized digital experiences. Ties in really well, I think, with what Claudia was talking about, taking ABM to the next level. So a trend that we're seeing out in the wild. So we saw those average length of someone who's attending an experience that's completely tailored to them was at 54 minutes. That's really high. And if we pop back to thinking about the average number of attendees for webinars, we saw a pretty big shift from Q3 to Q4. We saw that number rise pretty dramatically. And that's important. And I won't go into too much of a rabbit hole on this, but when we think about are people getting fatigued, they're really not. Audiences are consuming at a faster rate. But overall, we did see from 2019 to 2020 a really dramatic explosion in the total number of digital experiences that marketers put on. And I think this is important if we take these 4 data points together. The story that it really shows is we had a lot more digital experiences. We had to make up for the loss of a lot of physical events. And so even despite that, we saw people more engaged in those experiences. They're staying for longer. And the average number of people who showed up for each experience also continued to increase. So with that, I'm excited to be able to take some questions from the audience as well. But I think there's a lot of great things happening. I think what we need to really focus on moving forward, though, is making sure that we are thinking about it from that experience perspective. We don't want to leave people with dead ends.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cherie. That was really great, really insightful, and I just love all of these insights, and digital experiences are really, it's next level B2B at the end of the day, right? Next level everything. So we did spark some really great questions, but before we get to those, I just want to remind everyone once again to please take our survey before logging off today. It will really help us out. All right, quick thing about the questions. I'm going to run through about 3 or 4 today. If we don't get to yours live, we will definitely follow up with answers via email. So don't worry about that. All right, let's get to those questions. First one, this is a good one, and I think it's more of your personal opinion, Cherie, but I would love to hear your insights on that. How do you feel about webinar fatigue as we are on a webinar?
Good question. Oh, when you started that question out, you said personal. I thought someone was going to ask for my favorite Netflix series or something. All right. So I continue to be surprised at how audience engagement is outpacing what marketers are putting out from digital experience. So I think about fatigue from the perspective of once I see marketers outpacing the number of webinars they're putting out, and then we see an audience engagement drop. We see the number of questions drop, registration. So I correlate a bunch of different factors. Webinar fatigue is only real in the eyes of marketers. Audiences are not fatigued by them. When I look at the high level industry data, and I debate this with clients too, when they say, I think we're at webinar fatigue, I'm like, I think you might be tired of doing them, but your audiences aren't. I was talking to a really big client the other day. They're like, webinar fatigue. I'm like, all right. I'm like, and then I made them pull up their data with me. I'm like, what is fatigued about this? I'm like, you are, and that's okay. I think all marketers are burnt out right now. So I'll say that. But I'm not seeing it overall from an audience perspective. I think, yes, there are more digital experiences, more webinars happening. I think that the bar is higher for people. So if you do see audiences dropping off, I think that's where you need to really think about the format and those engagement techniques you're using. But at an industry level, we haven't reached this point where audience engagement rates, all those correlated items are dropping yet. I do think Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and this isn't really personal opinion here. If you look at the data out of Stanford, they're doing some interesting research about the fact that looking at yourself all day talk is very different than when we were in an office. You didn't have to see yourself, but if you're presenting to your boss all day, that's pretty exhausting, right? But I think that's different than what you have on digital experiences where, you can have your camera on in some instances if it's a smaller session, but there tends to be a little bit more anonymity. And it isn't as exhausting, probably for the presenters, I guess. The audience members, not so much.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And also, offering webinars or virtual presentations, anything like that on demand, and allowing the audience to choose a time and place to watch them, I think is really helpful as well. All right, next one. What are some other engagement techniques and tips?
So I would say, like, I think there's like a whole technology angle to that, but I don't need to go there. I think people know that if we're on 24 today, there's a lot of different tools that we have baked in for that. I think really what I would consider for people who want to have more engaging experiences is to look at the presenters that you're using and actually find ways to help them create more engaging experiences starting at the content level, getting people more comfortable with asking polling questions and being able to respond to them, being able to take more Q&A. I think it's a different muscle for presenters to do it digitally. So I think you can look at training sessions like that, but then also think about how you can change up the format to maybe do more panels, maybe just do more Q&A. I think, you and I, Claudia, could probably just spin up a webinar and start talking for an hour and get a lot of great engagement from between the two of us and with the audience. So I think playing around with formats like that is how I would look at engagement techniques that don't have to be technology based.
I love it. Oh, this is a good one, and it's my new favorite term, hybrid events. Everybody's talking about them. So how will hybrid events impact marketing strategies?
That's a good one. I mean, the word hybrid is everywhere, although I did hear a good one the other day. I might botch it. Phygital. So physical plus digital. Yeah, I know, right? Hybrid events were a thing pre-pandemic, and those were physical events where there's a live stream, and we called those hybrid. And then over the past year, there hasn't been hybrid. We've been all digital, but a lot of physical event players have been talking about hybrid. Like, we're going to go to hybrid. Even when we do get to return to travel, I don't know that we're going to be going to big events again, at least not for a little bit. I also don't know that companies want to fund T&E as much as they did in the past. But I do think that if there's one thing that we've learned over the past year is that the experience needs to be really contextualized. I do think people have always used both physical and digital means to create the events, though. Like, you usually weren't sending out a physical mailer to invite someone to a in-person event. So there's always been a mix of physical and digital delivery mechanisms. I think the only thing that will really change in the future is the at-event experience. We're going to have members that will be there in person and some that will be remote. And I think we need to level the playing field for both of those audiences to be able to engage better. But I think for hybrid, at least in the short term, I think it's going to be smaller group gatherings with a digital component. I've heard a lot about watch parties actually coming up, interestingly, now. So if we're all going to get into a conference room and watch a big event, I mean, we used to do that more for internal events, but maybe we'll start to see that more from a external event perspective too.
I love that. That's interesting. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how it all kind of plays out, especially because, I mean, the level of creativity from B2B marketers over the past year has been incredible. So I'm sure we will see some really creative and really cool and successful ideas. All right. Let's do one more. How should I be thinking about sponsorships for virtual versus physical? And I'll add to that versus hybrid.
That's a good one. I think, the assigned value to sponsorships definitely declined over the past year. I think the big issue will be how sponsorship or event organizers are able to justify the costs. Because as a sponsor, I don't really care if it's a physical or a digital person that consumes my content. I just want to know about it, and I want to be able to remarket to them afterwards. So I think we saw all of that innovation you talked about really happened more on the marketer side. I haven't seen that on the sponsorship side. I think those companies were very focused on survival for the past year. We need some innovation when it comes to the booth side of sponsorship, I think. But I think that gets to a trend we saw even pre-pandemic where it's really expensive and if you're telling me that someone who came in and grabbed a cookie or your t-shirt is a lead, I'm going to debate that with you every day of the week and twice on Sundays. So I think it gets back to the bigger thing is we had trouble justifying physical before. It was hard to measure, hard to think about. Now we have behavioral data. So I think we'll need some innovation there from a sponsorship perspective. But I would say to anyone who is sponsoring events this year, make sure that you have a content element. Make sure you're finding a way to have a speaking opportunity so you can get more information in than just hoping that someone wallows through a marketplace, because that's been where the challenge is for people.
Awesome. That was a great answer. All right. I'm going to cut the Q&A at that. So if we didn't get to your questions right now, don't worry, we'll follow up via email, like I said. So thank you again to Cherie for another awesome presentation. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. Please be sure to check out the next session coming up very shortly. It's called Using Purchase Formulas to Build the Perfect Inbound Pipeline. It kicks off at 1 p.m. Eastern, and I hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone. Take care.